Hello and a very warm welcome to the A.G. Leventis Gallery for Ancient Cyprus here in the British Museum. In normal times we would have thousands of visitors in the gallery every week, but because of the pandemic crisis this hasn't been possible, and this in fact is the first time I've been in this gallery for over 5 months. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome you all here to this virtual tour of the Ancient Cyprus Gallery, and I hope that you can enjoy this wherever you are at the moment. The collection of ancient Cypriot antiquities here in the British Museum is one of the largest and most important in the world outside of the island of Cyprus itself. It was mostly formed in the 19th century when Cyprus was ruled firstly by the Ottoman Empire and then by the British Empire. And on occasions like this, I always like to say that it's very important that we are commemorating the 60th anniversary of the creation of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960 here in the British Museum, because we are very privileged to be home to thousands and thousands of antiquities illustrating the history and culture and diversity of the island of Cyprus over thousands of years. Museums are great places to think about cultures in their geographical and cultural contexts. And here in the British Museum, not alone are we very proud to exhibit the wonderful collection of Cypriot antiquities, but we can show it at its best in the context of its Mediterranean and European and global context. The Cypriot collection was formed mostly in the 19th century, so in many ways it differs to the sorts of things you might see in the great museums of Cyprus, especially the Cyprus Museum in Nicosia. At the same time, the collection of Cypriot antiquities that was assembled here in the 19th century also tells the story of the discovery of Cypriot archaeology. But also more generally it tells us the story of Cyprus in the 19th century, because the story of archaeology is the story of how visitors to the island, as well as members of the local community, began gradually to discover the remote history of Cyprus that now represents more than 12,000 years. In this very brief virtual tour of the gallery, I want to give you a few highlights of this wonderful collection and also give you an idea as to how this collection was formed back in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries. As I've said before, this illustrates not just the archaeology of the island going back thousands of years, but also the history of the island of Cyprus itself. The archaeology of Cyprus is very well known today and can be seen in museums all around the world. This is thanks in no small part to the generosity of the A.G. Leventis Foundation, who have funded many galleries, including this one here in the British Museum. But for centuries, very little was known about ancient Cyprus, and it was only in the 19th century that archaeologists and collectors started to pay attention to its rich heritage. A very good example of this is the object here in front of me. This is called the Chatsworth Apollo, or the Thomas Apollo. It was found intact in 1836 by villagers looking for water near Politiko in central Cyprus. This was the site of ancient Tamassos. When it was discovered, it wasn't taken off to a museum or private collection, as would have been the case later in the century. Instead, it was broken up for scrap. The head was sold to a private collector who brought it off to Smyrna, who then sold it to the Duke of Devonshire, who took it to England, hence its name, Chatsworth Apollo, named after the home of the Duke of Devonshire. The leg of the statue, by another means, ended up in the Louvre in Paris. The bulk of the statue, however, disappeared, probably melted down for scrap. And indeed, the only reason we know this story is because it was recorded by a German archaeologist, Ludwig Ross, who visited the island in 1845 and heard the story from the villagers as he was travelling around the island exploring its ancient sites. This was very typical of this period, when interest in objects like this was very limited and in many cases restricted to its value as material. This is why it was melted down. We now know that this head belonged to a life-size bronze statue that was made in or around Tamassos around 450 BC. It's a masterpiece of Cypriot bronze casting. It was made with copper from the local mines that made the city of Tamassos very rich in this period. But the fact that it is the only life-size head of this kind to have survived from antiquity is a reminder of how objects like this were mostly melted down, and this is why so few of them survive. If you look around this gallery, most of the large-scale sculpture is made out of limestone or marble. Many of the objects we see here are in the gallery because they survived, not because they were necessarily the most important things in ancient times. And the rare survival of the Chatsworth Apollo is a reminder of how lucky we are to have preserve so many objects like this at all. Discoveries such as the Chatsworth head continued to be made over the course of the 19th century. But it was only really in the 1860s that the archaeology of Cyprus started to take off in a big way. The statue that I'm standing in front of was discovered in 1869 by a man called Robert Hamilton Lang. He was the manager of the Imperial Ottoman Bank in Larnaca. In addition to his work as a banker, he also ran a farm, he conducted archaeological research and numerous other things. What's interesting is that he didn't simply collect antiquities and sell them, as did many of his contemporaries who were also doing the same thing. Lang was in contact with Charles Newton, the keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities here in the British Museum. Newton advised him to keep his collection together and, more importantly, to record the site where the objects were found. In particular, he said that he should try and use photography, he should draw a plan of the site and show the precise location where objects were found. Lang went on to publish an account of his discoveries, which represents one of the earliest scientific archaeological reports produced on the island. And then in 1872 and 1873, the British Museum published the majority of his collection from the site of Idalion in central Cyprus, where this statue comes from. As you can see, it's a wonderful, majestic statue of a bearded male with fantastic curls, and he's also wearing a wreath indicating that he is in an act of worship. However, he's not just a mere worshipper, he is probably the king or the high priest of the ancient city of Idalion, where this statue was found. As I've just said, Robert Hamilton Lang's collection came to the British Museum in 1872. His was just one of a number of collections that were being acquired by museums around the world, such as by the Louvre and by the Metropolitan Museum in New York. However, what was really lacking in Cypriot archaeology was systematic excavation. It was only in 1887 that the Cyprus Exploration Fund was created here in the United Kingdom to conduct archaeological excavations on a large scale in Cyprus. The fantastic metre-high head of Dionysus standing just to my left was one of the objects recovered during that expedition. It was found in 1890, but not through regular excavations. It was actually built into the camel station of Lefka, near the ancient city of Soli, where the head was probably found. It dates to around 300 or 200 BC. It was very probably placed in the theatre of ancient Soli. Dionysus, of course, is very closely connected with ancient theatre. It's a wonderful object too because, as you can see, it's extremely battered, and that's because it was in fact built into the wall of a building. And again, it just shows, like with the Thomas Apollo, just how precious survivals like this are from antiquity, because this could very easily have been broken up for building stone. The Cyprus Exploration Fund did more than just gather up random objects from the Cypriot countryside, however. They conducted the first systematic excavations at the site of Paphos and the sanctuary of Aphrodite. They excavated the ancient city of Salamis in detail for the first time, and they also explored the cemeteries of the ancient city of Marion, objects from which enriched the museums in Nicosia, in London, in Oxford and Cambridge. And this really marks the beginnings of what we might call fully scientific archaeology in Cyprus. The British Museum itself was rather late in starting excavations on the island of Cyprus, largely because of the lack of money. It was only in 1892 that a private bequest from Miss Emma Turner gave the British Museum enough funds to conduct large-scale excavations of its own. Even though the Cyprus Exploration Fund had given the museum many of its finds, it was only in 1892 that the museum was able to organise its own fieldwork. And this resulted in a series of excavations extending down to 1899, which had a transformative effect on our understanding of the archaeology of the island. I'm standing in front of the so-called Foundry Hoard from Enkemi, which is a late Bronze Age settlement near the modern village of Enkemi, close to Famagusta. In 1896, the British Museum excavated 100 late Bronze Age tombs, dating to between about 1600 and about 1100 BC. The tombs contained a wonderful assortment of objects, Cypriot made, but also imported from all around the Eastern Mediterranean. Many of these objects can be seen in the gallery today. What was important back in 1896 was it effectively invented the late Bronze Age of Cyprus. Before this time, virtually nothing was known of this period. What's also important about the so-called Foundry Hoard, in front of which I'm standing, is that the excavators decided to keep what looks like a deliberate dump of bronze implements, some intact, some broken, that had been deposited at the site of Enkemi around 1200 BC, probably during an economic or military crisis, or possibly just as a religious offering. Previous archaeologists tended to throw away things like this, but the archaeologists in 1896 decided to keep this very precious hoard of bronze. And this hoard consists, as I said, of everything from broken implements to intact objects. And one of the most important objects in this hoard is the famous oxide ingot. This is a block of copper about 30 kilograms in weight, which was the standard shape for manufacturing and trading copper all around the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age. Around 300 of these so-called oxide ingots was found on a ship that sank off the coast of Turkey near Uluburun around 1300 BC. And this allows us to see the trading networks of Cyprus in operation. In the late Bronze Age, Cyprus was one of the key suppliers of copper to the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, and copper was exported in the form of oxide ingots or smaller bun ingots. And as a result of this, the island not alone became very rich, but it also started to display evidence of complex society and urbanism. What's important about this display is that it shows how only very gradually over the course of the 19th century did archaeologists begin to realize just how important Cyprus was in the ancient world. And the story of copper doesn't end with the Bronze Age, because down really to the end of the Roman period and into the Byzantine period, the Cypriot mines were producing copper for the Eastern Mediterranean as well. And in fact, that is why the modern word for copper in most European languages actually comes from the name Cyprus. All that trading in copper had a very big impact on Cyprus in the late Bronze Age, and you can see this in the objects that were being made at the time. One lovely example of the sort of interconnections and cultural contacts that this trade created can be seen in this clay tablet. It looks a bit like a large dog biscuit, but actually it is a letter between the king of Alashia, which was the name of Cyprus in the Bronze Age, to the pharaoh in Egypt. And they're basically talking about trading discussions. But of course, they address themselves in very familiar terms because Cyprus was regarded as one of the major political and economic powers of the region at this time. Letters like this are very important for understanding how trading activity was carried on, not just at an economic level, but also in cultural terms. And this produced an awful lot of cultural interactions and influences coming into Cyprus. Here is a selection of objects from Egypt or related to Egypt which appeared in the late Bronze Age. We have a so-called Tel Yehudi aware juglet which appeared in Cyprus in the 17th century BC. We have finely carved stone vessels which were very prestigious in Egypt. We have very delicate glass vessels that would have contained perfumed oils. And what I find particularly nice is, on the very right of the case, there is a glazed faience plate of Egyptian style that was copied from an Egyptian original by a Cypriot craftsman. And the scene also evokes the worship of the goddess Hathor, whose cult may have arrived in Cyprus from Egypt in the late Bronze Age as well. And it's very important to remember that it was as a result of these intensive trading activities that Cyprus became not just very wealthy, but also culturally very sophisticated. On the left side of the case is an example of Cypriot entrepreneurship, because Cypriots did not just trade copper and timber overseas, they also traded objects they made themselves. Here we have a series of small juglets that would have contained perfumed oils or possibly medicinal oils, which were deliberately designed to be appealing to customers all around the Eastern Mediterranean. One of these still has its contents intact, and recent scientific analysis here in the British Museum suggested that it may have traces of opiate. We don't know whether the contents of these juglets were used for medicines, for drugs, or for the simple pleasure of the smell, but it's a very good sign that Cypriots were responsible for trading all sorts of substances and materials and products around the Eastern Mediterranean at this time. The objects from Egypt I've just shown you are just one example of the many interconnections between Cyprus and the Mediterranean world in the late Bronze Age. Another close trading and cultural partner in this period was North Syria, as illustrated by these wonderful faience cups made in the shape of a human head and of a ram. These would have been used in rituals, whether in a temple or in a tomb. These would have been imported, as I said, from the ancient kingdom of Ugrit, where they were made. Another close trading and cultural partner in this time was Bronze Age Greece, as seen by these imported Mycenaean vessels, which date between about 1400 and 1300 BC. And it was at the end of this period, when the Eastern Mediterranean world was convulsed in a great economic and political crisis, that we start seeing the beginning of settlement from Greece in Cyprus, introducing probably the first speakers of the Greek language. However, trade between Cyprus and the Mediterranean world never really ended and continues into the first millennium BC. Again, we see many connections with the Aegean world, with Eastern Greece and with Attica. And this simply shows how Cyprus has always been at the centre of the trading networks of the Mediterranean world. A lovely example of the maritime and trading culture of Cyprus in the first millennium BC are these amazing terracotta models of boats. They date to about 700 or 600 BC, and they were found in the ancient city of Amathus, next to Limassol. The jug on the right shows an illustration of an actual Cypriot trading vessel, complete with large storage jars in the hold of the ship. And objects like this, as I've said, are a very nice illustration of how the relationship between Cyprus and the sea has always been very, very strong. And it's these maritime connections that have contributed to the huge economic and cultural importance of Cyprus throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. The earliest evidence we have for writing on Cyprus dates from at least 1500 BC, when we have a series of inscriptions written on mostly small objects such as clay balls or tools or ivory implements. This was called Cypriot by the great archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, who saw connections between the scripts of Crete that he was studying at the time and these newly discovered inscriptions in Cyprus. We can't yet read Cypriot, but in the first millennium BC, it was adapted to write the Greek language and another language that we call Cypriot. But what's fascinating is that this island-based writing system survived in use down to the 3rd or 2nd century BC until it was finally pushed out by the arrival of the Greek alphabet. It might come as a surprise when we know that a lot of people on the island spoke Greek in ancient times, that the Greek alphabet was only adopted widely from around 300 BC, when the island was taken over by the Ptolemaic dynasty based in Egypt. Another major language and writing system we find on the island in ancient times is Phoenician. Sometime in the early first millennium BC, as far as we can tell, settlers and traders came from what's now modern Lebanon and established communities on the island. They brought with them their language and their writing system. One of the most fascinating aspects of the cultural contacts between different language groups on the island is that sometimes you find inscriptions in both of the major languages, in Greek and in Phoenician, written on the same object. And this marble statue pedestal, just in front of us here, is a very good example of this. Now, what's very important to remember is that the Cypriot syllabic writing system was undecipherable until the middle of the 19th century, when an object like this, written in both Cypro-syllabic and Phoenician, was discovered. The Phoenician text helped to decipher the Cypriot part, and people then realized that it was in fact written in a form of Greek, but not written in the traditional Greek alphabet. Phoenician, like Greek, was used to express many elements of daily life and culture. You would find it on tombstones, you would find it on personal objects, such as things you would dedicate in a sanctuary to the gods. We even have a Phoenician shopping list. This marble slab here in the case, with a hole on top that would have been used for attaching it to the wall of a temple, has a list of requirements for a religious ritual. And you can see it's written in paint on a marble surface. A lot of writing from ancient Cyprus would have been written on materials that have not survived. And so painting on marble is something that is much less durable than carving it into stone. So again, we have to understand that most of the things that were written in ancient Cyprus have now disappeared. I've really missed these guys not being in the gallery for the past 5 months, because these are my friends. These statues are limestone images of worshippers that were placed in the sanctuary at Idalion that was excavated by Robert Hamilton Lang. We've met the high priest, or the king of Idalion. Well, these are his fellow worshippers and subjects. And what's wonderful about ancient Cypriot religion is it is so human. You see images of worshippers in their daily clothing, but also carrying things or doing things that gives us an insight into their religious, but also their social life. This collection of middle-sized limestone figurines would have been dedicated by people who had visited the shrine to make a dedication, perhaps as a thank you for the god getting them through some sort of difficult period in their lives. And the sculptures depicted them in the different aspects of worship. We see, for example, a chap playing a musical instrument, a double pipe. We see people holding animals that are going to be dedicated to the gods, a sacrificial ram or a bird. Other people hold boxes of incense for burning on an altar. Others hold vessels for ritual drinkings and making libations to the gods. And what's wonderful about this miniature army of worship is that this reminds us that ancient Cypriot religion, like most religious practices around the Mediterranean world at this time, was a very social occasion. Families and communities would come together to worship the gods. They would often sacrifice animals and then consume the flesh of the animals. And these would become communal feasts. And it was a way of bringing together the community physically. What's fascinating about the sanctuary at Idalion as well is that there's evidence that people from different ethnic and cultural groups all came together as well. There are bilingual inscriptions from Idalion as well, like the one I mentioned earlier, worshipping Apollo and Reshef at the same time and in the same place. And this just gives us a very strong sense how religion can be a very binding element in communities. Thank you very much for joining me on this brief virtual tour of the Cypriot collection here in the British Museum. And if you'd like to find out more, all of the collection can be found on the British Museum Collections Online database, which is free to access. This has only really been possible because of the kindness over many years of the people of Cyprus to us here in the British Museum, to the AG Leventis Foundation, to the archaeological authorities in Cyprus, especially the Department of Antiquities. And this event in particular has been made possible by the High Commission of the Republic of Cyprus here in London, with which we have had many wonderful events over the past few years. This year, sadly, we are unable to have a physical event, but I hope that this is a way of reaching out to even more people. And I'd like to thank the authorities at the Cypriot High Commission for making this possible. It's great to think that as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Republic of Cyprus, we are able to celebrate the Republic and its heritage and its history here in London, here in the British Museum. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do so.